Thank you, Derek. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, everybody who's on. And thank you generally to Shai Hacknight, who which actually is doing for civil society what the Chicago Inspector General's office has, during my time, endeavored to do with respect to the utilization of data and data transparency and transparency in general. And that is kind of model behavior that we would like to see from broader society. There are aspects to what we all do, and certainly as Inspector General, I did and the office does, which takes the form of kind of pointed advocacy, implied advocacy, and in the context of the Inspector General's office through Oversight and the reports that it issues with findings and recommendations on the sort of the investigative side with respect to indictments. All of those things constitute a sort of a form of advocacy for opportunities for improvement and a better way that are brought into the public domain, and through which, again, we model sort of transparency in the service of accountability. In stepping away and down as Inspector General, in the short amount of time, I've sort of been able to kind of step back and think a little bit about the significance of oversight and oversight functions as kind of standing at the crossroads and the switches between civil society and government in the service of sort of transparency and accountability. For those of you that aren't familiar with what an Inspector General does, Chicago happens to have kind of one of the best ones in the country for all of its corruption. An entity that exists independent under the law, although still part of government, whose actual legal charge is to promote economy, effectiveness, efficiency, and integrity in the operations of government. And it does that in two ways. One is through audits and evaluations, and there's specifically government performance audits, which are performed to federal standard. And the office, I should add, is subjected to cyclical outside peer review by national oversight organization, the Association of Inspectors General, and folks from the field come to the Chicago IG's office every 3 years and go through our systems and go through our files and interview everybody to determine whether or not we are conducting ourselves in compliance and comportment with best standards for independent oversight bodies. But back to the mission charge: economy, effectiveness, efficiency, and integrity in the operations of government. So through performance audits and investigations, all of those audits are very much public in that we go to the auditee, a department or a program within the city in advance. Actually, they're put on notice that we're likely coming their way by publishing an annual plan at the start of each year, listing topics that we expect to be opening audits on. We go to the agency and we work in a fairly collaborative way with the agency, including the opening conference, in which we actually encourage the government entity to offer up its perspective on things that they would like to have examined and assessed for efficacy of current performance, for risks. Sometimes they're risks in terms of data, and for suggestions as to how to do better. It varies whether or not the approach of the agency is to jump in and say, yeah, we'd love for you to look at things. More often than not, it's a wariness, but in that sense, sort of more of a frenemy approach to the engagement, but ultimately cooperative, because the entities are required by law to cooperate. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're going to come back to them before we publish anything and give them an opportunity to respond. And that back and forth is really important because while I've had really wonderful, smart people working with the organization who really are good at pulling apart operations and getting into the weeds on things and identifying weaknesses and operational things that are operationally substandard. At the end of the day, we recognize that we don't run the organizations ourselves. We don't deal with the day-to-day challenges of service delivery ourselves. And in that sense, we really want the kind of the insights and the perspective of the subjects of our audits to sort of tell us what's possible and what's not possible, all on the way to issuing a report in which we make both findings and recommendations, and the department responds. The other form of inquiry that we undertake are investigations, and they can be administrative, pointed towards possible violations of city policies, regulations, standards, practices, operational or otherwise. And in more serious forms, they take the form of investigations of misconduct that actually is violative of the law and of criminal law. And it could be state or federal. And in those situations, and those are often really large kind of contract fraud type of investigations or public corruption investigations. I think most of you probably know at this particular moment, we have 3 of our aldermen, our city councilors, under federal indictment. All of those are connected to investigations for which the Inspector General's office was part. But in those larger matters, where we identify major conduct, we bring it to typically federal criminal investigative authorities in the U.S. Attorney's Office, sometimes the Attorney General, and sometimes the state's Attorney's Office, that pursues what we bring to them in the form of a grand jury investigation and quite often an eventual indictment. And in an example of how all those things might come together, for those of you that know Chicago well and have been around here for a while, the city has a troubled history with its red light camera and speed camera program. The red light camera program long preceded the speed cams, but that was introduced with the notion of improving public safety. And through traffic studies, the identification of intersections where there was more likely to be bad crashes that were occurring. And so these cameras would be installed at these intersections, these red light intersections. And with the idea that the issuance of camera-based citations would modify behavior over time and result in less fatalities and bad accidents on the streets. And the people of Chicago always felt like, the premise here is public safety, but it feels like this is all being run to make a buck. And the IG's office took a look at that in the form of an audit. And what was found was over a period of a decade of its operation, that not a single camera had been changed. And the program did not operate where it was even looking at traffic data to determine whether or not behavior was being altered. And cameras weren't moved to where the greatest risks were. So the bottom line was it actually was being run to make a buck, not for public safety purposes. That audit revealed some curious conduct at the margins of how the contracts with the outside contractor was procured, that along with some information revealed by a Chicago Tribune investigative report and an incredible investigative journalistic undertaking, prompted an investigation to follow our audit, our own investigation. And that resulted in the identification of a nearly 10-year-long kickback scheme in which a high-ranking official of the city's Department of Transportation sort of massaged the process through which the camera vendor was procured by the city, and for years was receiving kickbacks from the vendor, and that resulted in a federal investigation, grand jury investigation, and an indictment and the prosecution of this high-ranking official, along with the chief financial officer for the company, and a middleman, a bagman. So the audit, when it was issued publicly, prompted the beginning of a whole series of changes in the program. The investigation resulted in basically the removal from the program and the government, the aspect of government that was running the program, individuals who were engaged in criminal conduct. The public outcry over both of those things resulted in a call for a further review by the IG's office around how the program needed to be changed in large respect. And so there's this back and forth. Audits reveal potential misconduct that results in investigations. Investigations result in identification of program flaws that can be turned over to the audit side. In all of this, in all that the IG work that proceeds, it's against a backdrop of a pretty rich data environment. The city collects massive amounts of data, sometimes with intent, sometimes incidentally. And along the way, the office sort of came to the conclusion that it was, rather than simply using the data in the service of individual inquiries, it ought to be trying to sort of master what that data landscape actually is in the city, to find ways to utilize the data in a sort of for predictive analytics purposes. And in order to do that, we had to survey the city to identify all of the databases that the city had. And then conduct interviews of city actors to identify how those databases are maintained and what they're specifically used for, but then also negotiate back-end access. And through the negotiation of back-end access, we essentially have created a data warehouse. And in examining all of this, or gathering all of this, what we learned quite often were the city's data systems were siloed. They were not procured with the idea that they ever can communicate with each other. Many of them, the dimensions of the data were not understood by the city people themselves. Having basically turned over to outside entities just about every form of data analytical need they might have. And so the city didn't know what data it had. And that sort of led us to a number of sort of identified opportunities and some insights around those. So first off, the city of Chicago, I mentioned sort of these siloed data systems. There was no rigor about how data systems were developed or purchased. There is no uniform standard regarding the standards of the data, whether it's inputting the data, whether it's quality standards, whether it's internal audit standards to check for accuracy and completeness of the data. And as you guys have all experienced, there's extraordinary variability in what gets published in the way of data and why. And I know you all are interested in the raw data itself. And if you look at the city's data portal, you will see wide variations in quality of data and no real sort of intentionality about what's there, why it's there, and whether the city itself has any objectives in bringing it forward, other than in the service of sort of this broad notion of transparency. We decided to do something about that, back to the point of modeling behavior. And What we did with the back-end access to an enormous amount of data is begin to build dashboards, and recognizing that much of this was the public's, belonged to the public. To do so, creating Tableau dashboards, visualizations that were interactive. And I'm going to pull up, for those of you not familiar with the work of the Chicago IG in this regard, I'm going to pull up our, give me a second here. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see. This is the homepage of the Chicago Inspector General's office. Scroll down just slightly from the top and you will see, actually, let me go back one here just a second. This is the homepage of the Inspector General's office, igchicago.org. The top of the homepage, you will see the information portal. Click on that. This is always a bit of a, I gotta close that window. Okay, here we go. The information portal. And there are 4 areas where the office has proactively created Tableau-based dashboards for people to look at aspects of the composition of the city or its operation. One of those is city finances generally, and you see a couple of things there. The city's budget going back, I think now 9 years, and a lot of information on a controversial form of funding of development in neighborhoods, tax increment financing. But that is not where I'm going to land at the moment. So I'm going to go back a second. Other areas, city employees, the composition of various departments, open OIG, which is really about things coming from the Inspector General's office. But the place that we've spent a lot of our time is with police data, public safety. So I'm going to open that up. And scrolling, each one of these areas contains lots of dashboards, 911 calls, which is a drawing in and an organizing of all 911 call activity, which has become an analytical sort of force amplifier for those who are trying to understand what the police department is called upon to respond to, and therefore what it does, and what percentage of its work, and I'll click it on for a second, even though that's not where I was going to land. Dispatch calls by geography, dispatch calls for CPD service, to determine what it is that we actually call upon the police department to do, what sort of calls. It's a little slow in buffering. Hang with me here for just a second. I hope it's just a second. There we go. And what you see is, first of all, city census data, but at the top here, okay, dispatch calls by geography. And so every call that comes in gets coded with the nature of the call and a bunch of other information. All of that is collected data. Some of it can be sort of changed and modified depending on what type of call it is and who is responding. Priority levels, but you see up here that the user, the public here, can filter in all sorts of different ways, call types. And there are gazillions of call types. But if you're interested in a specific subset of calls, you basically can clear and just click on it. So if you're just interested basically in alarms on CTA trains, for example, you clear everything else and you just click that. Behavioral health related, that is for the purpose of sort of identifying something that is the subject of much policy debate, and that is whether or not we should be having alternative forms of response to situations that are coded as involving individuals with possible mental health issues, because a disproportionate number of police uses of force involve situations in which we have a law enforcement response to a person who is actually having a mental health crisis, but doing so in a way that's threatening to other civilians. And you can get and this is all broken down by district, and you can go into each of these districts and look at this by sub-district and beat level. But the place that I want to other place I want to take you to, complaints and notification, which is the disciplinary history of all police officers. Investigatory stops are the successor to stop and frisk, which has changed since early 2016. And we have begun to overlay the police data, again, down to the ward level, the district level, all the way down to the beat level, with demographic information. And the office is working on overlaying that with other types of information from other public sources, economic information, various other information that can be obtained through census and other federal government stuff. But again, all filterable, pat down. This is for investigatory stops for which every single one of them is supposed to yield a report by a police officer. But you see that there are different types of activity within an investigative report. All of this down to the district level, that can be taken down to the beat level, that also has an overlay of demographic information. And so not surprisingly, you have a very, very different level, volume and level and nature of response and demographic engagement between police officers and residents of the city in certain higher crime districts, like the Harrison district, District 11, or Englewood, District 7. All of this is here. The way that we get here, though, involves a lot of front-end work, because the city's data typically is notoriously incomplete and quite often dirty. So there's a whole lot of front-end work that needs to be done. And the reason that I'm raising that is the data that underlay, and here's some other examples: investigatory stops by district, by ward, census demographics, those that involve searches, an overview, and there's other types of policing activity, tactical response reports, the same type of breakdown all the way to the beat level. For tactical response reports are the reports that have to be filed every time a police officer uses force. Another on the composition of the department, which if you go into it, you actually can sort of examine demographic trends that would tell you that not only is it not the case that the department's current demographic composition does not mirror the city, but it's actually getting worse right now with respect to African American officers. We're about to hit a demographic cliff at the very moment, and you can see this from the data, that that we will be having a lot of African American officers retire. We are also at an all-time low in terms of African Americans being recruited into the department itself. So we have a challenge in that regard. All of these things, interactive, public-facing, user-friendly, filterable down to sort of the geographic and community characteristic level that you individually are interested in, that's all out there. But it's all, the overlay here is a massive amount of data work that has been done by the Inspector General's office to clean, complete, explain, verify, and restructure raw data received from other city departments. And I raise that for this reason. There is a very strong argument to be made, that should be made at this point in time, that the data that lay behind much of what you see in the IG's office is the data as it should exist in the rest of city operations itself. If it's CPD data, the data as it should exist in its cleanest, highest, most accurate and complete form, That's how it should exist within CPD. And I say that for this reason. There needs to be a discussion had about whether the data that's behind the IG's dashboard is in fact the city data that should be made available to civil society. My conjecture, my surmise with all of you is, while you're trying to figure out good and interesting and revelatory things to do with the data that the city puts out there in raw form, that you're constrained by the fact that the quality of your analysis and what you may want to do is limited by the fact that it often is not clean, it often is not complete, and you don't have insight into why, and you do not necessarily have access to other forms of data and information that will allow you to bring it to that higher form to verify it. So one, there needs to be a public discussion about whether this actually should be regarded as the city's data for purposes of FOIA. And it also should be a prompt for a discussion about whether this modality of presentation, of visualization of data, is the higher form of transparency, which the city more broadly should be aspiring to and achieving right now. And until the city does that, it's reliant upon the kindness of strangers, you, the folks at Chicago Hack Night, to try to figure it out. But your problem, your challenge is, you only can work with what's given to you. You can only work with what you have access to in the form that you have access to it. And so I think it's really time for the data community to come together with the policy and community advocacy community leadership to discuss whether or not there's some form of kind of unified pitch, whether it's in the form of legislation, whether it's in the form possibly maybe even of a lawsuit, sort of where some of these issues would get vetted in the context of a FOIA action, but about whether or not the modeled behavior that is reflected here, and again, this is an independent city agency, but it's a city agency. This is city data, actually needs to be brought fully to the public, the raw data itself. And I will tell you that, to me, bodes for a world in which you, civil society, can actually sort of have the shackles taken off of you and sort of be this dynamic, synergistic, and almost collaborative force, working quite often creatively with government on new ways of exploiting the data, of new ways of using the data for greater transparency that the government itself isn't going to have the bandwidth to do, but where the interests of civil society brings people like you to the table to say, hey, let us help. Let us figure out some new things here as well. We are at that moment, and that moment comes at a critical time in which the legitimacy of government is really eroding. And part of that erosion has to do with limitations on access. I believe that the example of independent oversight bodies and the modeling behavior that's done with data of this nature is actually a prompt for a larger engagement with all of you in terms of a new relationship with government, where it is more proactive and it is more collaborative in the service of transparency, and transparency through data, among other things. And I'm going to stop there because my understanding is that there's lots of questions. So I'll bring it back to you guys.
All right, thank you. You're right. There are many questions. And I think especially on the last point you were making around the data behind these dashboards and its relationship to the city, there's actually several questions about that. And I think it'd be helpful maybe just to hear a bit of maybe some clarification from you around, it doesn't look like you can download the raw data behind these dashboards. And it doesn't look like the data on the IG's website is available on the city data portal, for example. Could you explain why that is, and maybe whose decision it is that is sort of like we're waiting on for that to be possible?
That's a fantastic question. And it's exactly where the rubber meets the road. So ultimately, the IG's access to it comes as a matter of law. The rest of the city is supposed to provide the IG with the information that the IG is seeking. But ultimately, it's not the IG's information. It's the department's information. They possess it, right? And so then when we get, when I'm saying we, I'm no longer there, but when the IG's office gets a FOIA request, and this happens at the federal level as well as the local level, it's first of all, it's not our data. Second of all, the permission really has to come from the originating authority. So with a lot of what we looked at, CPD, for example. And then if a request is made to CPD, a request is being made to CPD for the IG's version of the data, because that's not what CPD is working with. You would think in an ideal world, CPD would say, all right, we don't audit our data, we don't clean our data, it's incomplete. The IG has done all of that work for us. We're just going to take all of that in the modified clean form back and then start using that. They don't do that. And so there is this sort of logistical conundrum. You ask the IG says it's police data. You go to the police department says, well, if you can get it, we're going to give you this version of it because that's the only one that we maintain. That just shouldn't be the case. There should be this sort of whole government perspective that says, nope, that's the best version of your data. Please give the IG permission to release that to you, or better yet, would you please put that forward so it's accessible to everybody? That's proactive transparency.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I think just to follow on to that, it's ultimately the decision of, for example, CPD, but other agencies that you work with and do investigations with, it's sort of department by department, it's their decision ultimately, right? So has there ever been a case where, the bag stopped getting passed and enough people said yes, and a FOIA request to you all has been able to be opened up?
No, because no one's, and that's what I'm raising here, Derek, is no one's really pressed the argument that, you know what, notwithstanding the fact that it's not the data that you're using, that's city's data, and that's the city's data in the highest form. So you have the authority to tell the IG to release it. The law should be, if it's FOIAble, you should be obligated to tell the IG to do that. No one has pressed that argument yet.
Okay. You want to take the next one, Claire?
Sure. In the investigation of the red light cameras that you mentioned, it looks like the city's behavior in running the program has not significantly changed as of today. For the two follow-up questions, why do you think that is? And then does it indicate that the IG's office should have more teeth to impose consequences for bad actions?
So two forms of question there, and they're both very good. So one is the first one, that the city does not appear to have changed the operation of the program sufficiently to kind of address the original issues identified. That would suggest that the city itself is not utilizing the data in a sort of continuous improvement kind of approach to things. It also suggests that the city council itself, and this is a big problem, is look. And this isn't saying anything bad about anybody. We're all human beings, and most of us need to be kicked in the backside from time to time to sort of raise our game, right? And that's why we have systems of checks and balances in government. And in a government, typically, things have been set up in the United States where legislative branches are the check on the executive. Right now, the city council does not operate as a meaningful check and meaningful oversight itself on the executive. And in an ideal world, the work of IGs would serve the legislative branch, and they would then hold hearings. And those hearings would be the true calling to account of the program people. That's not being done. That step is not being made. So people need to talk to their legislators and really press. And unfortunately, given the orientation of many aldermen in the city council, which is sort of more towards constituent services rather than larger program or policy oversight, you're not likely to get much attention. And given the fact that the checks and balances don't operate in truly independent ways here, and that's because the mayor actually appoints committee chairs, essentially, and the city council acquiesces, you don't have very many meaningful hearings on these issues. And so you have to figure out a new way to sort of bring about the hue and the cry. The suggested response of giving the IG quote unquote teeth to actually enforce, that is conceptually problematic. In terms of achieving results, that would get us there. But what it would mean, and this is not an inconsiderable sort of problem to be addressed, is if the IG's recommendations had to be followed and had to be enforced, that would box out the IG from taking a look at the program in the future. Why? Because the IG would be evaluating and auditing a program that was devised based on its own recommendations. It is essentially the IG's version of the program. We're no longer at that point independent, neutral, and objective in what it is that we are examining, right? So the IG function has to stay separate. We do occasionally in long cycle come back and re-examine something, and it is probably time to look at the red light camera program. And the speed camera program, especially, prompted by recent sort of city itself findings that it is inequitable in its operation. That should be a prompt for a legislative hearing. That probably should be a prompt for further IG examination. But an example of something we've come back to the well on is Chicago Fire Department response times, where we found that the department actually didn't do much of anything in the way of examining their response times and how to improve them, and did not utilize 911 call data to actually assess whether it was correctly calibrated in terms of its overall staffing and equipping of the fire department to meet the needs that it is called upon to respond to. And what I'm calling to mind there specifically is that the fire department is still staffed and structured basically to be a fire response operation when 80% of its calls are emergency medical service calls. And that just screams from the data. And so 7 or 8 years ago, we looked at all of that and we called all of that out, and the fire department didn't do anything about it. And we looked at it again earlier in this year and reported out on that. And this time around, it seems that there is now a greater inclination to kind of move in that direction, but 7 years, no action. And so I am sympathetic to the notion of sort of IG sort of enforcement powers, but that should only be necessary when the rest of government is failing. And that's the problem right now, is the city council isn't doing its job.
Okay, thank you. Next question from the audience. There's a question that we have, but also I think I'll sort of take it and kind of add a little bit to it as well, which is someone is asking about being able to audit, or I suppose view or FOIA, that transformation logic that, the work that the IG's office does when it takes this dirty data from a city agency and then uses it to produce a report. Is it possible to audit or FOIA that work in a way that someone could then kind of like just reproduce the steps and the work that you and your team already did?
So that's interesting. Because then the question would be, would we be capable of doing that simply as a process matter, separating it out from the actual data itself? Because once it's sort of tied to the data, we get back into that problem that we were talking about before, right? So it becomes sort of a backdoor means of getting at the data, also with the benefit of sort of the process information from the IG's office. What I do think is more easily done is a request to have the people who lead that section come in and say, look, these are the modalities that we go about it generally. This is how we do it. These are this is the way that we test it at the front end. These are the red flags that we look for. This sort of gives us our baseline, and this is how we go about it. There's no secrets about that per se, but it's also under FOIA law an odd thing to sort of be making a request for a process.
Mm-hmm. I think in my experience, people have been successful in FOIA-ing code, running code. But if the process is more about individuals doing work and sort of running it through a process, that's a harder thing to FOIA.
Yeah.
But you can FOIA code. So it might just be, a hint for folks at the IG's office, maybe figure out a way to turn your work into code. That way someone could FOIA it later.
I can't recall whether anyone from the CD unit, which is the data analytics unit, has come and spoken to you. And if they haven't, I think a direct request ought to be made.
Okay, good to know. Claire, you want to get the next one?
Sure. Let's see. Okay, I'll try this one. What data would be most helpful for accountability efforts? I'm assuming this person name means police accountability. In terms of data set, combination of data, speed to getting data, detail level, if you could have whatever you want, what would help accountability efforts for the most for three things? A, police, okay, B, spending, and C, overall accountability. I'm happy to repeat any part of that.
Yeah, no. I think I have the feel of it. So if the question is, what would the IG's office need? The answer is, we get most everything that we need. If it relates to a particular sort of form of inquiry or review, we're going to get what we need to do that. The bigger challenge as it relates to CPD is actually they're not sufficiently populated with experts, internal experts, to manage their own systems and understand their own systems. And that means that we've got to do a lot of sleuthing ourselves. If it's from a civil society perspective and what would be most efficacious in the service of sort of informing people, what they need, what in the way of data sets would help them understand and work towards understandings of how the department operates and patterns and trends. It's partly why I raised what I raised as sort of a moment here, which is we do that same assessment ourselves. And that is reflected in the order in which we build and then go and do second and third generation work on these Tableau dashboards, which is why I say the shortcut maybe to the answer to that question is go to that stuff. That's where all of the policy discussions and debates about policing in the city and what's going on in our communities is being had. That is what motivated us to actually develop those dashboards. It's absolutely the case that community organizations and their policy people and their data people and that folks like you would think about more different and more creative ways of bringing different data sets together to generate new insights. But the IG can only do so much of that because it has a job to do with respect to formal audits and evaluations and investigations. And so that's why I sort of put it in terms of modeling behavior. Most everything that we have created is sort of incident to a need that the IG's office has to conduct effective audits and investigations.
So I think we probably have time for one more. We'll see, maybe two if we're lucky. This next question is, when you think about the quantity of cases versus the quality of impact of cases, how do they compare? Which sources of cases have the highest impact? Are there any legal reasons or ways that the volume of trivial cases can hinder more impactful investigations?
Oh God, yeah. So look, one of it's a balancing act. So the office is I left the office twice as large as I came to it, more than twice as large. And when I came to it, it was a very limited audit office and mostly investigation. Most of those investigations were relatively small bore, minor administrative matters. And not too long before my time, a massive amount of what the investigation section did were things like residency cases, right? And you think about, okay, what's the real impact of residency cases? And each one of them matters. Somebody's not following the law, and that matters. And there was a policy judgment made about the importance of city employees being residents of the city. But they're also they're incredible time sucks, labor intensive, and they don't yield big impacts in terms of changes because you got to do it individual case by individual case. So you got to do this triaging at the front end. But you also can't leave laws completely unenforced. You can't just make the unilateral decision, the legislators made this policy decision to enact this law. We disagree with that. We're not going to bother. So you have to have some sort of representative quality to the overall mix of cases that you're in. We are, though, and I mentioned residency, we are endeavoring, or we were when I left, endeavoring to do something which I hope is done with data that would allow us to shift from an investigative modality to a compliance modality where people have to, on an annual basis, certify and provide certain baseline information that would itself kind of condition behavior in the sense of people saying, well, I got to say all this stuff. I got to put it into a certified statement on an annual basis. I don't think I'm going to be able to dodge this residency thing. It's sort of, and to the extent that you find outliers, and we've determined you can write algorithms with respect to all sorts of combination of public data and internal data to sort of red flag who's most likely to be a residency violator, and approach it from a compliance perspective and just say, hey, look, we've crunched the data, we've crunched the information. Department head, go and ask some questions of this person, right? To further condition the behavior. So we try to think of ways where maybe we could sort of turn to that compliance modality to free up investigative resources for the more impactful. But you're always in this situation where you're trying to sort of meet a lot of different kind of interests and equities in the context of an office that, for all of the resources that it has, it can only do so much in relation to all there is that needs to be done.
All right. Well, I think it's 8 o'clock on the dot. So we have unfortunately run out of time, but thank you again. We covered a lot of ground. Really appreciate your time that you gave to us. And yeah, hopefully this conversation can continue.